From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Donald Trump blames a second assassination attempt on rhetoric from Democrats, even as President Biden calls for additional resources for the Secret Service. We'll have the latest on the investigation and discuss the political implications with political management professor Matt Dallek of George Washington University.
Vice President Kamala Harris meets with Teamsters President Sean O'Brien today in hopes of securing the union's endorsement. We'll discuss with economist Betsey Stevenson from the University of Michigan.
And we'll talk with MacGuineas from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget on the competing tax proposals from both campaigns and what they could mean for the deficit. So a lot is ahead this evening, but of course we have to begin with the news from yesterday. For the second time in just about 2 months, an attempt on Donald Trump's life. Of course, we just heard an update from investigators down in Florida where this took place. They confirmed that the would-be assassin never even had Donald Trump in his line of sight.
That's right.
And was never able to fire off a shot.
Remarkable to learn as well. He was there for over 11 hours, according to cell phone location data, huddled in a shooter's nest in the bushes along the fairway of this golf course. Now, Kaylee, of course, we've had a big discussion today about resources for the Secret Service. Is there enough manpower? Is there enough money? Is there enough material to keep these candidates safe? And is it, in fact, a matter of allocation? Joe Biden talked about this, all, by the way, earlier today, commenting on the Secret Service in a speech unrelated in Philadelphia. Let's listen.
I commend the Secret Service for the expert handling of the situation. And the former president is protected from harm, and the subject is in custody. Let me just say, there is no, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, those of you who know me, many of you do, no place in political violence for political violence in America. None. Zero. Never.
For more, let's go now to Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari. So, Jonathan, of course, we've had bipartisan condemnation of political violence like this. We also have heard from both sides of the aisle in Congress, frankly, calls for a vote on more resources for the Secret Service. The task force that already had been formed to look into the first assassination attempt from back in July is now looking into this as well. What role will Congress play moving forward here?
Yeah, I mean, immediately, as you mentioned, there's the funding issue and potentially adding more resources. As you know, they have to pass a funding bill this month to avoid a shutdown. So that's one avenue where they could maybe possibly quickly increase the resources for the Secret Service. How quickly the Secret Service could deploy that money, spend that money, I think is another question. But this task force that was already looking into that first assassination attempt is already asking for a briefing from the Secret Service on this event. When you have two events, it suddenly makes it look like maybe their investigation starts to look at things more systemically instead of just looking at one single event.
Well, it's interesting because we heard from the Speaker of the House on Fox News this morning. He watered down this idea of a funding problem. He said, quote, "It is about manpower allocation." We just heard, however, in a briefing from the acting director of the Secret Service, Ronald Rowe, quote, "Increased assets directed by Biden were in place yesterday at the golf course." He went on to say the president is aware, he was asked if he spoke with Donald Trump, is aware that he has the highest levels of protection that the Secret Service is providing him. We're constantly evaluating that threat, and if we need to ration it up additionally, we will. Are we getting an honest take, Jonathan, on the resources directed to Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, at this point, all we can do is take the official's word for it, right? None of us know exactly the exact number of Secret Service agents assigned to him, or else they probably wouldn't be doing their job. So it does sound like they have increased his security services or his security detail since that first assassination attempt. And it does, if that is the case, it does kind of go maybe towards Speaker Johnson's point that maybe it's not a resource issue and more of an operational issue. Again, I think that's something that Congress will want to look into as well.
Well, it's remarkable that this is the second time now that his life has been threatened. After the first time, of course, it was the eve of the Republican National Convention, and he talked about how he wanted that to be a moment for unity, to bring the country together. After this attempt, it seems he has shifted his messaging a bit. Now he is talking about the rhetoric from his opponents, first Joe Biden and now Kamala Harris, saying that they are effectively to blame for the attempts on his life. How should we consider the political campaign implications of this?
Well, this is Donald Trump being who Donald Trump has been his entire time. You know, he did briefly call for unity. That was pretty short-lived. As soon as the convention was over, he's pretty much back to his own self. At the debate last week, he talked about blaming Democratic rhetoric for the first assassination attempt. I think he gained some sympathy after that first shooting. It's possible that he gains some more now, but clearly he's using this to portray Democrats as radical. And I think a lot of Democrats would say that his divisiveness and his approach to politics is what's kind of caused this spiral that we're seeing in many areas. This is the most dramatic example, but certainly there have been other examples of violence, of threats that have targeted members of both parties.
Jonathan, it's great to have you at the table this evening. Jonathan Tamari, Bloomberg government covering Congress and the campaign for us on Bloomberg as we now look ahead to Wednesday's results of the Fed meeting that starts tomorrow, the rate decision coming this week. Former New York Fed President Bill Dudley commented on Bloomberg earlier today.
The market has come to the view that 50 basis points at this meeting is, in fact, appropriate. It's pretty important that the Fed head back to neutral expeditiously, and that 25 basis points wasn't fast enough.
Hold on with 50. 3 Democratic senators are now calling on the Fed to make a 75 basis point rate cut, writing, quote, if the Fed is too cautious in cutting rates, it would needlessly risk our economy heading towards a recession. The committee must consider implementing rate cuts more aggressively up front to mitigate potential risks to the labor market, unquote. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, you see Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of the 3, signing that letter as we add Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe's voice to the conversation. Amara, it's great to see you. Until now, it had been a question of 25 or 50. No one actually thinks we're talking about 75, right?
No one thinks we're talking about 75. But I think the letter from these 3 Democratic senators today kind of underscores what the concern is going into the meeting. Is the Fed behind the curve? You may remember after the July jobs report, it was really disappointing, and there was sort of a fever pitch that the Fed was behind the curve because it didn't cut at its last meeting. So the question now is, how are Fed officials taking in all the data we've gotten since that last meeting, and will they feel like a bigger cut, a 50-point cut, is what's appropriate right now?
Well, and we don't really know what their feeling is in real time because they've been in the quiet period ahead of this meeting. We are actually going into this with no clue what the ultimate decision will be. This is very rare. They usually like to have signaled to the market beforehand what they're going to do. So are they going to, if the market's betting on 50, are they going to want to take the market by surprise and go 25?
Listen, I think Fed officials are going to have a really vigorous conversation about what is appropriate, right? I think it is really rare that we have not really a clear signal going into this meeting. The officials that we heard from before we went into the blackout period kind of left it open, and they were kind of like, look, we're going to assess the data, we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to decide. I don't think the Fed likes to be boxed in by the markets. I think they have emphasized throughout this inflationary period that we've seen that they're going to be guided by the data and that they're going to do what they think is right based on what the data is telling them. So the problem is the data is not really clear right now.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you add the confusion of politics here, add the dot plot, this is going to be an interesting dance for Jay Powell when it comes to be news conference time on Wednesday, isn't it?
Yes, I think people are going to be listening to Jay Powell really closely to hear how he justifies whatever move that they're doing, right? If they go 25, why did they go 25? If they go 50, is it because they're more concerned about the labor market than maybe they've let on? Or are they just trying to maybe catch up from the fact that they didn't cut back in July? So I think people are really going to be listening to him very closely for his rationale. And then they're also going to be listening very closely for what the path of rate cuts will look like going forward. How fast, how quickly are Fed officials going to move? Because they are in restricted territory, and some people feel like they should be moving very quickly to get us back to that so-called neutral place.
All right, well, less than 48 hours to go until we find out. Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, we'll take a look at the status of political violence in the U.S. following the attempted assassination of former President Trump yesterday in Florida. We'll have more with political historian Professor Dallek of George Washington University next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
he's lost his sense of morality, if he's able to see the good in Ukrainians and the bad in Putin, but unable to see how evil his alleged act would have been to try to kill former President Trump. So yeah, clearly he's not all there, but then again, normal people don't try to commit crimes like this.
That was Dave Ehrenberg, state attorney for Palm Beach County, on the earlier edition of Balance of Power, discussing the suspect in the apparent assassination attempt against Donald Trump yesterday. Former President Trump, of course, reacted to that attempt on his Truth Social account today, saying, quote, "The rhetoric lies as exemplified by the false statements made by Comrade Kamala Harris during the rigged and highly partisan ABC debate has taken politics in our country to a whole new level of hatred, abuse, and distrust. Because of this communist left rhetoric, the bullets are flying, and it will only get worse," end quote. We're joined now for more on Bloomberg TV and radio by political management professor Matt Dallek with George Washington University to take a look at rhetoric and political violence in America. Professor, thank you for being here on Balance of Power. Donald Trump, of course, is blaming his opponent in what is a very soon, 50 days out, election. But is there some truth to his statement about the rhetoric, frankly, from all sides of American politics right now, and just how hot it is?
Yeah. Well, the first thing about Trump's statement is that it really intensified, I think, the vitriol, right? It was not about toning down a conversation in any way. Sure, the hateful political rhetoric flows in all kinds of directions. But of course, with the former president, it's very hard for him to make a case that it's simply the left to blame. We saw January 6th and what happened after his rally speech. We've heard him look at what's happening in Springfield, Ohio, after the hateful comments that he and his running mate, J.D. Vance, have made about Haitian immigrants eating pets there. He's bashed the media as enemy of the people. So does he have a point? A little bit of a one. I mean, there are certainly elements that cross ideological boundaries that are spewing all kinds of vile. And in a country awash in guns, someone who's mentally ill, we're seeing what we have now. But certainly the former president has got to be considered part of this equation, especially after January 6th.
Mm-hmm. So this is a potentially very dangerous moment. When you consider all of this, Matthew, the rhetoric that we've heard from Donald Trump today, he's essentially blaming Democrat rhetoric for this. Democrats call him a threat to democracy. Elon Musk on Twitter asking why no one is even trying to assassinate Biden/Kamala, as he has since deleted. Bomb threats are going to schools in Springfield, Ohio, because of the rhetoric about Haitian immigrants eating pets. Matthew, how does this end?
Well, unfortunately, first of all, I'm a historian, and I have a hard enough time interpreting the past, let alone predicting how it ends. But it's still an important question. My concern is that there's a high potential for it to get worse after the election. I think that would be the most kind of dangerous point on the immediate horizon, because what happens if Trump loses, or what happens if he wins? I think we've got to go back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the country was in the middle of the Vietnam War, thousands of people dying, riots, over 100 cities exploded after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert F. Kennedy was killed. There was a national commission on the causes and prevention of violence. So we are in, I think, maybe the most fraught politically violent moment since really in 50, 60 years. And it's going to maybe take the work of a generation to get out of it.
Well, in 50, 60 years ago, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have social media platforms in which all of this could be propagated around the world with such speed. How does that actually make the difference here? Does this make it an exponentially more dangerous moment than anything before it, just because of the nature of the technology that allows it to be facilitated?
Yeah. My view of social media is that it's a tool, and it can be used for all kinds of purposes, right? As you just quoted about Elon Musk, right? It can be used for hateful ends. And it does turbocharge, I think, conspiracy theories, racist tropes. It accelerates the pace sometimes of politically violent rhetoric and actions. But I don't think that we can, because the reality was, the United States in the late 60s, early 70s was a more violent place. Gerald Ford, 17 days apart, September 1975, was the subject of 2 assassination attempts. The United States has had a pretty substantial history of political violence. And I don't want to minimize the role of social media. It certainly supercharges what we're seeing, but I don't think it really captures quite the root or all the root causes of what's happening now.
It does underscore how quickly the news cycle is moving here, though, Matthew. We thought one of the top stories today would be Donald Trump posting, "I hate Taylor Swift." That was at 10:44 in the morning. Things changed pretty quickly after that. At what point is the voter too exhausted to make a judgment?
Well, look, on one level, I think a lot of people are disgusted. They're fed up. And this, I think, raises a larger important point, which is national institutions in particular, our governing and political institutions have been damaged and battered over the past decade. And the ability for those institutions to hang together, right, to allow the country to settle differences peacefully at the ballot, not with the bullet, that I think is the great question. And I fear that people turning off from politics, people being disgusted with it, is just going to drive the extremes, make them more extreme, and also empower them and make it more difficult for the center to hold.
Matthew, it's good to have you. Thanks for joining our conversation. Matthew Dallek, professor of political management at George Washington University. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, a look at how each of the candidates are leaning into labor in their policy proposals, including the most recent attempt by Kamala Harris to win the endorsement of the Teamsters. Betsey Stevenson, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan, will be with us next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
I take President O'Brien at his word that what matters to him is allowing his members and the leaders of the union alongside him to hear the views of the candidates for president up close and personal. I think it'll end up an endorsement because the discussion will be about policy. And on labor policy, there is simply no question that Vice President Harris has built a record that is far better for the Teamsters union than President Trump's record.
That was Seth Harris, former top labor policy advisor to President Biden, speaking to us on the early edition of Balance of Power today, as Vice President Kamala Harris held an important meeting sitting down with the Teamsters union, which has yet to endorse a candidate in this race. They met today in Washington. For more, we're joined on Bloomberg TV and radio by Betsey Stevenson, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan, former chief economist at the Department of Labor. Betsey, it's great to see you. Welcome back. It's not even so much the Teamsters union, right? But Sean O'Brien, the head of the union, who Kamala Harris met with today. And he had said, having spoken at the Republican National Convention and maybe changed his tune on politics after he heard Donald Trump's interview with Elon Musk talking about firing workers. He said he has not endorsed Kamala Harris yet because, quote, you don't hire someone unless you give them an interview, unquote. Is that all it takes? Will he endorse Harris after today?
I think that he is doing his job representing the Teamsters, which is he is making it clear that they aren't committing to a particular party just because of a party affiliation. But what he cares about is who is going to be best for workers, who's going to be best for unions. Now, the reality is that a lot of the things that he wants and that he wants for the Teamsters, such as making it easier for other workers to join a union, to join the Teamsters, those kinds of things he's more likely to get out of Vice President Harris in the same way he's been more likely to get support for unions out of President Biden. You even had, as you noted, President Trump sort of giggling with Elon Musk, which is, the way to keep workers in line is fire them. if they threaten to organize or they threaten to strike. That's not going to win any favors or support from the union. So I would be surprised if we don't see a Teamsters endorsement of Kamala Harris. But I think it's also worth noting how, tough they're being about saying you don't get it for free. We're making sure that you're out there representing the interests of unionized workers.
Well, yeah, to your point, Betsy, Sean O'Brien called that economic terrorism, the ideas propagated by Donald Trump and Elon Musk in that X conversation earlier this summer. If we could just examine, though, the year we have seen, it was a Teamsters strike with UPS, an agreement that had to be made between the UAW and the automakers, now Boeing with 33,000 workers on strike. If we do see a Harris presidency, would you expect that kind of behavior, unions trying to exercise more leverage over these companies with the support of whoever's in the White House to continue?
Well, I think that's sort of a complicated question. I don't think that whether workers strike or don't strike has anything to do with who's in the White House. What I think has happened over the past year is we have seen growing support for unionized workers from the public, which has increased the bargaining power of unionized workers and unions. And I think that a lot of employers have gotten themselves caught a little bit off guard by the fact that, well, their unionized workers are going to use that increased bargaining power. And if they're not getting what they want, they're going to strike. Well, think about something like the UAW. The UAW came to the table and basically gave up everything when it looked like the auto industry might collapse. And what they saw was, real wages that had been stagnated for quite some time. And then they said, hey, you guys are doing great now. We want more. And I think that the sort of initial stingy response they got, did not match the amount of bargaining power they currently had. You're right that it's a little bit helped when you have someone in the White House that's on their side. But I think the real issue here is are we going to reach a new equilibrium where unions and firms can bargain together and reach compromises without needing to strike?
Betsy, we're short on time this evening, but just quickly in 30 seconds, what do you expect the Fed does on Wednesday, 50 or 25?
Well, I think it's a coin toss. Personally, I would do 50, but I think that there's an argument for 25. Look, the labor market's clearly cooling, but we haven't gotten quite everything they want out of inflation. So it's a balance of risks. I hope they do 50, but as I said, I think it really is a coin toss at this point.
All right, Betsey Stevenson, flipping that coin. Thank you for joining us, Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Michigan. We appreciate your time, and we'll have more coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And remember, what I'm going to do is something that nobody has ever even thought about doing. No tax on tips.
When I am president, we will continue our fight for working families and eliminate taxes on tips for service and hospitality.
I want to cut taxes on Americans while putting tariffs on China and foreign countries to bring our jobs back home.
All the while, he intends to enact what in effect is a national sales tax that would raise prices on middle-class families.
As part of our additional tax cuts, we will end all taxes on overtime. You know what that means?
My plan is to give a $50,000 tax deduction to start up small businesses.
No tax on tips or on overtime. $50,000 tax credits for small businesses. Tariffs. Just some of the policy ideas that Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have floated during their presidential campaign so far. But we want to take a closer look at these actual policy suggestions now and what they might mean for the deficit with Maya MacGuineas, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, who is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Maya, it's always great to see you. Obviously, we don't have all of the contours and nuances of these various plans at this point, but we do basically have the headlines. So at the headline level, which is going to be worse for the United States debt and deficit?
Well, first off, you just put those clips all together in one place, I think, just to get my blood boiling. Like, this is the biggest kind of Oprah Winfrey moment of economics, of free this for you, and you get this, and you get this, and you get this. And we can just see them ratcheting it up and competing on giveaways that literally are making every economist around the country kind of blanch at how the incentives are wrong, the vision is wrong. This is just not a comprehensive economic strategy. You asked a specific question on sort of which plan is worse, and there's no question that so far with the policies that have been released, we've seen a higher price tag on the level of pandering that's coming from former President Trump. But let me be clear, both of them are talking about adding potentially trillions of dollars to a national debt that is at near record levels, that is already projected to grow by 20 trillion, like we're going to be borrowing that much over the coming decade. We are not looking at anybody putting forth a plan that would address the fiscal challenges. So as we keep the price tags we're following the price tags of all of these plans. We are going to release this in a couple of weeks. We will definitely come and talk about this with you all, but it looks like both of them would add trillions of dollars to the national debt, and it looks like former President Trump's plan would be significantly larger from what we've seen so far.
Okay, that's a starting point. We can add tariffs to this conversation as well, Maya. And this came up yesterday. J.D. Vance is doing the rounds on Sunday morning TV, trying to make the case for extending the Trump-era tax cuts, pursuing the ones we've talked about here on tips and overtime, Social Security. When he was on Face the Nation on CBS, the vice presidential nominee had more to say. Let's listen to J.D. Vance, so we'll have you respond.
You have to take some recognition, Margaret, that this is a negotiating tactic. You go into some of these negotiations, and sometimes you're going to have to do higher tariffs. Sometimes you might be able to do lower tariffs, but I don't think you go in saying you're going to do exactly this on every country. You use that as part of the negotiation. If you say you're not going to do any tariffs, you're basically going into these trade negotiations completely unilaterally disarmed.
So, Maya, despite the potential inflationary impact of tariffs that most every credible economist has described to us here on Bloomberg TV and radio, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have suggested that the tariffs might actually help to pay for some of the tax cuts that they're proposing. This is getting pretty confusing for our listeners and viewers who are trying to make investment decisions, never mind who they want to vote for, Maya. Does that make sense to you?
Well, this one you can look at from a lot of different angles. So the tariffs are kind of perhaps the most interesting policy that's going on, because on one hand, it is correct that the revenues that would be raised from the tariffs would potentially be quite significant. They were significant under the Trump administration. And as people know, some of them have stayed in place under the Biden administration. They are talking about much larger tariffs now going forward that could raise more revenue. However, it could have larger negative economic effects. So really the dynamic effects are so important about both how it would slow growth, how it would increase inflation, and what the retaliatory response would be. So figuring out the ultimate level of revenues is very difficult to pinpoint. The second point is there was that idea of let's use that money and put it in a sovereign wealth fund. That means then that the deficits would still be larger. I'm not going to even go into a sovereign wealth fund because it's hard to imagine a country that's running $2 trillion deficits every year being in a situation where a sovereign wealth fund is sort of the next item on our agenda. But I think the major point that I think about when I think about this issue, and it's an important one, is that our national security objectives don't necessarily align with our economic objectives. And we are going to see this in many instances, no matter who is president. But as you're looking at things like deglobalization, industrial policy, tariffs, there will be a lot of things that are done in the name of national security that may be bad for growth. So I think we're actually going to need a whole new framework of how you start to evaluate not just the growth effects, but what the trade-off is this good for national security? Is it worth the loss of growth? But something like tariffs at this moment where you're still fighting inflation would certainly be inflationary and would have profound effects on consumers and the overall economy, even if it did raise significant revenues. And it might not, depending on what other countries did in response.
Of course, Maya, revenue is one side of the ledger. The actual spending is the other. And spending is a much more immediate concern on Capitol Hill as we're 15 days away from a potential shutdown if they can't sort this out. House lawmakers will return tomorrow, I guess, try to push through a continuing resolution of some duration. What is optimal here if it's not the regular appropriations process?
Well, the regular appropriations process hasn't taken place in so many years that none of us really remember what it looks like to pass a budget on time, to pass appropriations on time, and to avoid this nonsense. So the problem with that, of course, is that not only are you not picking your priorities, the budget is a statement of a country's priorities. We're not going through that exercise. It leaves absolutely everybody who's engaged with the government in one way or another not able to plan anything. So this year it looks like we will have no appropriations done. I do not think we will have a government shutdown. I was pretty certain of that last time around. I'm a little bit less certain this time, just because it's so hard to get agreement even within the parties, let alone between the parties and between the bodies. But the best thing that should happen is they should have a short-term CR so that this doesn't drag on too long, because we really need to resolve this and pretty quickly go back. We have caps in place from the Fiscal Responsibility Act. We should be complying with those acts because those caps, we have a limit on how much spending on the discretionary side we're going to do. I don't think caps that aren't thought out is the most strategic way to do government, but it is a way to keep spending lower in some areas of the government. We need to not bust those caps, and we need to quickly move on to, are we going to extend them going forward? And are we going to look at where you can actually find savings in the other parts of the budget, the non-discretionary parts of the budget, which is where the real money is?
We do have a breaking headline on the terminal right now, Maya. That brings us to the other major story we're following here, a second attempted assassination of Donald Trump. The Biden administration is now officially asking Congress to surge Secret Service funding in what they're describing as an anomaly request. Would that be part of, or should it be, a stopgap budget plan?
So, I mean, all of these things that are added to what's going on in the trying to fund the government shouldn't be there, because you should have a simple CR as often as possible and find other ways to pass the priorities. That said, clearly that's something that we need to be thinking about. We need higher levels of security in this really dangerous time. It's quite frightening and really chilling what's happening. And I just kind of want to remind, when we talk about fiscal responsibility all the time, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be spending new money. It means simply we need to pay for these things. So every priority that people are talking about, no matter how important it is, no matter how many of us think that will be a good use of dollars, it's not just about we need to spend the money. It's also, okay, how are we going to pay for it? Are we going to cut some other spending, or are we going to raise new revenues? We have reached the point where every new spending initiative that comes along, that's not even part of the discussion. And sometimes people think like it's a poison pill to even say, how would you pay for that? It's not. It's just a basic sense of budgeting.
Maya, it's good to have you back. Maya MacGuineas, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and always a pleasure to have you with us here on Balance of Power. Coming up on Bloomberg, we'll have a look at the fallout of the second assassination attempt we've been discussing against Donald Trump yesterday, and what this means for the campaign trail. Our signature panel is up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
One was a very public event at Butler on July 13th. And then when you look at yesterday's attempt, this was a private, the former president going out golfing. How in the world do we get to the point where we have shooters at both places, one who knows all about it because it's so public, and another who shows up at an event where the former president of the United States is in a private golf outing event with a couple friends? That's an entirely different venue.
That was Republican Congressman Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania earlier today on Fox News, talking about how these assassination attempts against Donald Trump could have occurred. We still have many questions. Joining us now for more, our signature panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Join us now. It's great to have both of you with us. And Jeannie, I'm going to start with you. Of course, there's an investigation going on. We're not going to turn you into law enforcement analyst. Broadly speaking, after the reaction that we saw following the first attempt on Donald Trump's life, there was a feeling of empathy. Of course, he was going into the RNC at that point. There was talk of Donald Trump as a changed man, and it changed the way some people look at him. Will this be different this time?
It seems already that it's different. We don't know yet. Obviously, things can change. But, you know, the reaction last time, we even heard Donald Trump himself talk about the fact that he was a changed man and he was saved by God for a reason. We haven't heard much of that this time. And I thought very, very quickly this morphed from a concern about security and the safety of this leading presidential candidate to politics. I mean, Donald Trump himself sent out an email on a fundraising message shortly after this horrific event and said he was fine, but it was followed by a link to fundraising. And of course, the political rhetoric has ginned up since then on all sides. So, you know, I'm not sure we're going to see the same kind of reaction, but it is stunning to think that we can have an event like this and the sort of quickness, the speed at which it passes and changes into something political has been just a matter of hours.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you mentioned, rhetoric, Jeannie, Donald Trump today is pointing directly to what he dubs as communist leftist rhetoric from Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and says they are the reason that there have been attempts on his life. Is any side being really responsible about this rhetoric question, Rick?
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody's really been responsible. And look, if you hope to have some empathy for you don't immediately turn it into a fundraising proposal like Jeannie said, or immediately attack your opponents and make it a cause and effect. So I think we've descended into sort of the third ring of political hell here, where people have sort of lost their perspective that there's actually hundreds of millions of Americans getting ready to make a final decision on who to vote for. And it's just descended into this finger-pointing exercise. And I don't think either campaign has an advantage here. No one's taken the high ground. And look, the first time around, it seemed like a one-off, this was a horrific thing. And thank goodness that Donald Trump just barely got missed. And now it's problematic because I think all we have to talk about now is political violence, right? This is not just a one-off thing. And I think if we want to see, a more peaceful transition into the election, we have to take the rhetoric down, not ramp it up. And so I think that it's incumbent upon both campaigns and both candidates to take it down a few notches.
We've been asking people all day how to describe this moment in American politics, and you chose your words pretty well there. Jeannie, the third ring of political hell is how Rick Davis just described this moment, remembering it's not just Donald Trump or politicians bringing the rhetoric. Elon Musk put a message on Twitter that he has since deleted, quote, "And no one is even trying to assassinate Biden Kamala," it says, with an emoji, a thought emoji. It's just, is this the campaign where everyone's saying it all out loud? Jeannie, how would you describe this moment?
I won't have such a good one as Rick Davis, but, I think I give Elon Musk credit for taking that down. That is an example of irresponsible rhetoric that should not come out of the lips, mouth, or tweets of anybody in a position of leadership who has a following in this country or anywhere else. It is irresponsible. It's irresponsible of Democrats when they do it, and we saw it. It's irresponsible of journalists. We've seen some of them do it. It's irresponsible of somebody like Elon Musk and certainly Donald Trump today. We've got to tone down the rhetoric, but I also think we can't blame everything that has happened on rhetoric. We don't know, quite frankly, the cause of either one of these assassination attempts, and I think there's got to be a sober look at the circumstances surrounding both of these, and I hope we do get that, because there's also other issues at play here, including mental health, the Secret Service, and the ability for anybody in this country to get weapons of a kind that nobody needs outside of the military. All of those issues come into play, and we need a sober discussion about how we're going to address those as well.
Well, of course, the would-be shooter in this case is actually alive to face some of those questions, including around motive, which differentiates this from the Butler incident back in July. Now, as we question the Secret Service here and the role it will play going forward in protecting Donald Trump as he actively campaigns to be president once again, we spoke with Brian Gant, former Secret Service member during protecting Obama and Clinton during their presidencies, and this is what he told us.
If the Secret Service had their way, President Trump wouldn't go into any open air areas. He would always be in hard areas. He wouldn't do any rope lines. He wouldn't do the things that, as a security professional, put him at danger. But staff, and understandably so, they want him to be seen. They want him to be a man of the people. They want him to reach out and shake hands. And so, that tug of war is a real thing.
He obviously was shot back in July during a campaign rally. The Secret Service has now, Rick, installed essentially new bulletproof glass around him when he appears at outdoor events like this. A golf course is maybe something different. So if you're the campaign now trying to chart out his schedule, how does this second incident factor in to your decision-making around where he goes and how he conducts himself in the next 50 days?
Yeah, at this stage of a campaign, security is always a fundamental aspect of it, and candidates are different, right? John McCain hated security. He just wanted to be left alone. He wanted to go out in the crowd anytime he wanted to. He didn't want to be separated by barriers. And he even rejected Secret Service protection for a long time until literally the nomination was secure and he was going to the convention. So that's different than a person like Donald Trump, who served as president, had his regular detail protection around the clock and has that ever since then. So he's much more comfortable in the confines of a security bubble. But you can't put a bubble all over the country, right? And we've known for a long, long time that if an individual with a will to attack somebody and with a plan that's effective, there's very little you can do to stop that. And so the Secret Service, I thought, in this instance, reacted very well. They had a plan to get out there ahead of the foursome going out, and they identified a potential threat, and they acted upon it immediately. I get it, but what are you going to do? Put a bubble all over the, Palm Beach area and disrupt the entire community? And frankly, I don't think Donald Trump wants to disrupt the entire community. He wants, the activity to go around him as normal as possible without too much disruption. So it's a balancing act, and there's a lot of finger pointing. Jeannie's right. Everyone's looking for a scapegoat on this, but the reality is that if they need more resources, they should be given it. But there is a limitation on what even a very experienced Secret Service can do to protect an individual.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino will be sticking with us. They'll have final thoughts up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's time for final thoughts now with our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, joining us ahead of the return of the House back to Washington tomorrow with attempts to avert a government shutdown. Top of the agenda, Steve Scalise, Rick, the House Majority Leader, has scheduled a vote on the stopgap funding bill for tomorrow. You think this can pass in this House of Representatives?
I think the SAFE Act is a poison pill. As long as that's on that bill, it's not going to pass. There are 8 Republicans who aren't going to vote for it, and they've made that known before, which is why the bill hasn't passed to date.
So we're just ripping off the Band-Aid here, Jeannie. Everyone knows it's going to fail. This gets us on to Plan B. Is that the point?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get a clean CR from the Senate. That'll pass. And I think the big question here is, why is Mike Johnson putting up a bill? We know he doesn't have the votes to pass unless he's got something in his pocket. I mean, this is a problem. But, yeah, they're going to have to get something from the Senate that's clean.
Neither of you think that we're going to shut down, right? You're both still in the same place.
No
Jeannie, you don't see a shutdown. Rick, you don't either.
No, I don't.
Simple as that.
Yeah.
Jeannie still says no. Just quickly, is this a Mike Johnson problem or a Tom Emmer problem? Is this the whip?
Yeah, you can't whip a bad bill. And so Johnson's caved to Donald Trump. This is a Donald Trump problem. He's disrupted the flow of Congress. He's gotten in the way of passing a bill that'll give us government funding. And the reality is Johnson's going to have to show some backbone and stand up to the president.
Well, they're back to business tomorrow. Kaylee, we'll have a lot more in the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, we thank you, as always, for the insights Tomorrow will be another important stop on the campaign trail as well, Kaylee, as Kamala Harris speaks to the National Association of Black Journalists, remembering what happened when Donald Trump was in front of the NABJ. We'll be listening closely.
Yeah, of course, that was the appearance in which he questioned Harris's racial identity. She may field a question about that from that same organization when she sits down with them tomorrow. We'll, of course, have full coverage for you here on this program, as well as in the Washington edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online. And we'll see you for the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.